Hi everybody, this is Katje, and tonight I wanted to move to a more positive note. I know that the last few videos I've made have been about some rather gruesome things, some very violent crimes and negative incidents, and so tonight I want to move in a more positive direction and tell a story, a true story, about what I consider the most important thing that ever happened to me, at least so far in my life. So before I tell that, I just wanted to make a brief remark about makeup. One thing that I've learned, it was another mistake I think that I was making. This time it had to do with eyeshadow, at least for my features. I was tending to put the lighter eyeshadow on my eyelids and then around the eye socket using the darker color. And I found that actually it works better for my face to go the other way. So I put the darker, when I'm using eyeshadow with a blending brush, I tend to put the darker eyeshadow shade on my eyelids now, and then sort of surround that with an aura of a lighter color, maybe in the same shade. So tonight I'm using a L'Oreal blue palette, and I think that works pretty well. I don't put anything underneath the eye. Again, as I explained in one of my last videos, I want that to be very luminous. So after I put some concealer there, and then of course foundation and powder, I want that part of the under the eye to be bright, so that brings up the light in the face. And then I would use the darker eyeshadow shade on the eyelid, and then I would use the lighter shade, perhaps in the same tone or a related tone, around the eye socket, off to the sides a little bit. So what I want to do now is tell you this experience, basically from my own life. And to tell this story, I need to go back to when I was about 13 years old. So I grew up in a small town in the South, in Tennessee, and I was kind of an odd child. I had friends, but I also liked to be alone. I was an only child, and so I spent a lot of time by myself, kind of making things up. I used my imagination a lot. That was very important to me. So it was, I think it was in the spring, maybe the early summer, when I was about 13 years old, when this experience happened. Now, leading up to that, I guess I need to give a little bit of background, because it's important to kind of see what led up to this experience, and then also what came after it. So when I was a child, around this time, 11, 12, 13, I remember that on Saturday mornings, after we watched cartoons or played some games or whatever, I would have a lot of time on my hands, and I remember getting into this habit of getting on my bicycle and riding out into the countryside around my parents' house, maybe a mile or two, or sometimes I would hike. I would take a walk into the forest, and I would spend quite some time doing that. And what was interesting to me, what became clear to me over time as I would take these Saturday trips on my bicycle or on foot, is that I felt as if I were looking for something. It was a very strange feeling, because I didn't really know what it was, and I didn't know what it would be if I found it. I certainly didn't know what I would do if I somehow found it, but it became something almost compulsory, or it was a very deep need. I was looking for something that I didn't really understand what it was, and yet I felt compelled to find it. And so this went on for quite some time, maybe not every Saturday, but over a 6-month period, let's say, fairly frequently, when the weather permitted, I would be doing this. And so I would go out looking for whatever this something was, and I never found it. So eventually I stopped looking for it. I didn't know what I was supposed to find, and so I was very disappointed and frustrated, so I stopped, and I stayed closer to home. So that leads up to the day when I was 13, and this is the experience that I wanted to share with you. So on that day, it was probably, I think it was in the late spring, sometime in there. And I was on the street in front of my parents' house. I hadn't gone anywhere on my bicycle. I hadn't taken any of those trips that I had before. And I heard this amplified voice coming from a farm that was maybe about a quarter of a mile away, just down the hill from my parents' house. And so there were a few trees that I had to go through to come closer to that, and then I sort of came to an overlook, and I could see that there was a house there, and evidently somebody had passed away, somebody had died recently, and the source of this amplified voice was an auctioneer, because all of the person's belongings were displayed on the yard around the house. It was actually a small farm, and so the auctioneer was crying a lot, as they say. In other words, he was auctioning things off, people were getting bids, and it was sort of echoing throughout the morning air very clearly. Now that's when I had this very strange experience, and basically what happened was everything stopped. I could still hear the person's voice, I could still see all the things in the yard and the people milling around down there, but it was as if there wasn't any time anymore. Everything had stopped, just kind of in a freeze frame, except for these sounds and these sights. And I also remember having a very, very strong positive feeling that there was this very powerful, kind intelligence, loving intelligence behind all of this. It was almost as if the entire scene was being held in the hand of something gigantic that I couldn't see. But I had a very, very strong feeling that this was real, and that this thing, whatever it was reaching out to me and asking me to pay attention. It's almost like somebody snaps their fingers to get your attention, and then you're sort of zeroed in on it, and that's it. You're fixated on whatever this is. Now, I didn't know at the time what that presence was or what it meant. The only thing I know is that I didn't want to leave that overlook where I could see, the house and the auctioneer and all the people milling around, all the household goods that were displayed out on the yard. I wanted to stay there. I didn't want to do anything else all day long. In fact, I probably would have stayed there forever if at some point the time started to come back and the experience started, the vividness of the experience began to fade. And so then eventually I found myself back in sort of the ordinary world, and things were going on. I went back up to the street in front of my parents' house, and I sort of hung around there for a little while because, again, I was hoping that this strange experience would resume, that it would happen again, but it didn't. But whatever that was, I felt at the time that was like a watershed moment in my life. It was very, very important that I have that experience, and I realized that whatever that was, that's what I had been looking for all those times in the past, in the recent past, when I had gone out into the countryside on my bicycle, or maybe hiked in the woods, looking for something, trying to find something that I didn't know what it was. And now I knew, well, whatever that presence was, whatever that feeling of benevolence and kindness and sort of all-encompassing power was that I experienced that day, that Saturday, that's what I was looking for. So then that was it. And for many, many years, I didn't have that experience again. I didn't really feel it again until many, many years later, when I was actually in graduate school studying philosophy, and I was a first-year graduate student, and it was in one of my first classes, and so this is kind of the time when you have to sink or swim, and I had a very tough professor for that seminar. It was a pro-seminar that I had to take. Actually, it was a seminar that I took in the second semester, my second semester in graduate school. And I had to write a paper on a topic that was very, very difficult. So I remember almost when I was by myself in the reading room thinking, well, how am I going to write this paper? How am I going to fulfill this assignment? I remember all of a sudden that feeling came back to me, that same feeling that I had had all those years ago when I was 13 years old, and I felt that, well, everything is going to be okay. That whatever that is with me now, and I had come up with like the beginning of an idea, and then I felt like I was being encouraged to pursue that, and it worked out. I was able to write the paper, I was able to get a good grade on it, and learn something from it, and try to succeed in improving my philosophical education. Something very, very good came out of that. And many, many times since then, when I've been faced with a challenge or a question or some kind of a problem that I need to find an answer to, I felt now that I can more consciously turn to that presence. In a way, it's like things have never changed. There's a part of me that's still back there all those years ago when I first experienced that presence, but it's also here now with me as I've gotten older. It's still there. It really hasn't changed. It really hasn't gone away. I've made certain turns here and there and moved different places, but it's always there, and I can turn to it when I need help, and it will give me some kind of a guidance. Or if I don't know which way to go, if I'm looking at a choice between one or more alternatives, then if I think about one and this presence comes into me, I feel like, well, that's a sign that I should pursue that. And I have to be honest that whenever I've done that, it's turned out, even if in the short term, maybe it didn't seem like that was the right thing to do, in the long run, it was. And so it became clear to me that the name for this presence was God. That this was my most primal and basic experience of God. I had grown up and gone to church, and I still do. I am a religious person. But my most powerful experience of God, what I understand God to be, is not this, not something that I first encountered in a church, but it's something that I encountered that day when I was 13 years old, and that I encountered later when I was in graduate school, faced with this problem of having to write a very tough paper, and that I now can experience when I feel that I'm faced with a challenge or something that I need to, a problem that I need to solve or overcome or find a way around. This presence is with me, and so it was all those many years ago in a completely non-religious context that I had this very powerful experience of what I understand to be God. And I have to be honest that I would never seriously doubt the existence of God. Now, I'm simply saying this as a way of sharing my experience. I'm not trying to preach to anyone, and I certainly understand that many people who've grown up in a religious culture or in a religious household have suffered terrible things because of that, and that makes me very sad. I think it's the truth, though. We have to admit it, and those of us who are religious need to try to be compassionate and sensitive to those kinds of concerns. But I do think it's interesting that God, whatever God is not confined to any particular human institution or gathering of human society or anything like that. I think that it can come to people through those things, but I don't think it's limited to that. And I think that God is a God of mystery, a God of power. I think He's also a God of surprises. So that's what I wanted to share with you this evening, and I hope that I didn't come across as preachy. I'm just trying to be honest and share something with you, an experience with you that I do consider to be definitive. It was a defining moment of my life. And I feel that also when I present myself in my feminine side, I feel that that's a part of how God made me. So what I would say to people who may be wrestling with that question is that people, whether you're gay or you're transsexual or a cross-dresser or whatever it is. It might be something entirely different. God has made you that way. If you are that way, then that's not a choice that you made. You may choose whether or not to act on it, but to feel that way is not something that you chose. That's the way that you were made. And I think that God, that power that I experienced in a very moving way all those years ago and continue to experience today, that power made you that way, and God doesn't make mistakes. So that's all I wanted to say. I wanted to share that experience with you, and I hope that maybe it will encourage you to reflect on these questions for yourself. But each person has to make up his or her own mind about how they feel about this, and that's okay. So anyway, it's nice. It's a very nice night here in the desert. Things are beginning to cool off. We had a very nice rain today, so finally I think the summer is over and we're moving into fall here in the desert. That's nice. So I wish everybody a good evening. Thank you for being patient with me and allowing me to share this experience with you. So this is Katje Eckhart. I wish everybody a wonderful, restful night.